On a freezing winter night in January 2022, the quiet suburb of Canton, Massachusetts became the center of one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern America, a case that would ignite nationwide debate, divide communities, and turn a single tragic death into a sprawling mystery filled with conflicting narratives, disputed evidence, and accusations that continue to echo through courtrooms and social media alike. The man at the center of this tragedy was John O'Keefe, a veteran Boston police officer known among friends as disciplined, dedicated, and deeply committed to the people around him. But by sunrise on January 29th, he would be found dead in the snow outside a suburban home. Standing at the center of the investigation was his girlfriend, Karen Reed. According to prosecutors, the story was tragically simple: a relationship argument, alcohol, and a moment of anger that ended with a vehicle striking O'Keefe and leaving him to die outside in the cold. Yet from the very beginning, the case refused to follow a simple path. Questions surfaced almost immediately. Timelines didn't align perfectly. Witness accounts varied. Evidence sparked debate among investigators, analysts, and eventually, the public. To understand how this case became one of the most widely debated criminal investigations in recent years, we must begin with the night before the discovery. On January 28, 2022, Karen Reed and John O'Keefe spent the evening socializing with friends in the Boston area. Like many winter nights in New England, the weather was cold, the streets dusted with snow, and bars filled with people escaping the chill. Throughout the evening, the couple visited several locations with friends, talking, drinking, and enjoying the night. Nothing about the evening appeared unusual to those around them, but as the night progressed, their group eventually moved toward a gathering at a private residence belonging to friends in Canton. According to the prosecution's timeline, Karen Reed drove O'Keefe toward the house shortly after midnight. The allegation presented later in court suggested that during this moment, a confrontation occurred. Prosecutors argued that Reed's vehicle struck O'Keefe, causing fatal injuries before she drove away, leaving him outside in the snow. But the defense would later argue something entirely different, a version of events that challenged nearly every part of that narrative. When morning arrived, the story took a dramatic turn. Concerned about O'Keefe's whereabouts, Karen Reed and others began searching for him. Eventually, outside the Canton residence, they discovered his body lying in the snow. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, but the damage was already done. The discovery immediately triggered a criminal investigation. Police began reconstructing the timeline of the previous night. Theories formed quickly. Within hours, investigators began focusing on Karen Reed as the primary suspect. Prosecutors would later claim that damage to Reed's SUV, combined with witness statements and cell phone data, supported their theory that her vehicle had struck O'Keefe. But as the investigation progressed, the case began attracting intense scrutiny. Small details raised large questions. Analysts began debating the physical evidence. Some experts questioned whether the injuries were consistent with the type of collision described by prosecutors. Others examined the digital evidence, including phone records and location data, attempting to piece together exactly where each person had been during the critical hours of the night. Meanwhile, the house outside which O'Keefe was discovered became the focus of speculation. If the prosecution's theory was correct, then O'Keefe had never entered the home that night. But if the defense's theory held weight, then something far more complicated had happened behind closed doors. As investigators continued their work, the case slowly evolved from a tragic death into something much larger. Rumors began circulating online. Independent investigators, bloggers, and true crime enthusiasts started examining public records and testimony. Soon, the case was no longer confined to the courtroom or the police department. It had become a full-scale public debate. Supporters of Karen Reed began questioning the official narrative, suggesting that key evidence may have been mishandled or overlooked. Others believed the investigation had followed the correct path, and that the prosecution's case would ultimately prove its claims in court. As weeks turned into months, the tension surrounding the case continued to grow. Every new development seemed to deepen the divide between those who believed the evidence pointed clearly in one direction and those who believed critical questions remained unanswered. Investigators continued examining vehicle damage, medical findings, witness statements, and digital timelines. Each piece of evidence became the subject of intense scrutiny. In many ways, the investigation into John O'Keefe's death had transformed into two parallel stories, one unfolding in official legal proceedings and another playing out in the court of public opinion. And as the case moved closer to trial, one thing became clear. This was no longer simply a local tragedy. It had become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in the country. As the investigation into the death of John O'Keefe progressed, the case against Karen Reed moved steadily toward the courtroom, where competing narratives would collide in front of a jury and an audience that had grown far beyond the walls of the courthouse in Canton, Massachusetts. By the time legal proceedings intensified, the case had already captured massive public attention. Crowds began gathering outside the courthouse during hearings, some supporting the prosecution's theory that a fatal collision had occurred, others rallying behind the defense's argument that the investigation itself might have been flawed. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors laid out their central claim that Karen Reed, after a night of drinking and tension in the relationship, struck John O'Keefe with her SUV and drove away. Their case relied on a combination of physical evidence, digital timelines, and witness testimony. Prosecutors pointed to damage on Reed's vehicle and argued that the injuries suffered by O'Keefe were consistent with being struck and left outside in the snow during the harsh winter conditions. They also focused on statements allegedly made by Reed in the hours after the discovery of O'Keefe's body. Statements prosecutors suggested indicated awareness of what had occurred, but the defense's response was equally forceful. Rather than simply disputing small elements of the prosecution's argument, defense attorneys presented an alternative interpretation of the entire sequence of events. According to their theory, O'Keefe may have entered the house that night and suffered injuries inside before being moved outside. Defense attorneys questioned the reliability of certain investigative procedures and suggested that critical details had not been fully examined. They pointed to inconsistencies they believed existed in the timeline of events, as well as questions about how evidence had been collected and processed. As the trial unfolded, each side called expert witnesses, analysts, and investigators to support their positions. Medical testimony became a key point of debate, with specialists examining the nature of O'Keefe's injuries and discussing whether they aligned with the type of vehicle impact described by prosecutors. Digital forensic experts analyzed cell phone records and movement data to reconstruct the timeline of the night. Meanwhile, testimony from individuals present at the gathering added another layer of complexity, as memories and interpretations of events varied. Outside the courtroom, the case continued to generate intense discussion. Online communities dissected every piece of testimony, every document, and every photograph released through the legal process. Some observers believed the prosecution's theory was supported by the available evidence. Others argued that unresolved questions about the investigation left room for doubt. What made the case particularly unusual was the scale of public engagement. Rarely had a local criminal investigation sparked such widespread online analysis. Amateur investigators reviewed timelines, studied weather reports, and debated forensic interpretations. The case effectively became a real-time study in how modern criminal trials unfold in an era where information spreads instantly across digital platforms. As proceedings continued, the courtroom became the stage for a deeper examination not only of what happened that night but also of how criminal investigations are conducted. Defense attorneys raised questions about investigative procedures, while prosecutors emphasized the totality of the evidence they believed pointed toward a clear conclusion. For the jury, the challenge was enormous, sorting through complex testimony, technical analysis, and conflicting interpretations to determine what the evidence truly proved. For the public watching from outside, the case represented something broader, a window into the fragile balance between evidence, perception, and justice. Regardless of where individuals stood on the central question of Karen Reed's guilt or innocence, most observers agreed on one thing. The case had exposed how complicated modern criminal investigations can become when every detail is examined under a national spotlight. Even after months of legal proceedings, debates surrounding the case continued to intensify. Supporters of both sides remained deeply invested in the outcome, and the story of that winter night in Canton continued to raise questions about how events unfolded, how evidence was interpreted, and how justice would ultimately be determined. The death of John O'Keefe had begun as a local tragedy, but it had evolved into something far larger. A case that forced investigators, lawyers, and the public to confront difficult questions about truth, evidence, and the limits of certainty in complex criminal investigations. And as the legal process continued to unfold, one haunting reality remained at the center of the story. Somewhere within the competing narratives, the full truth of what happened on that cold January night still waited to be definitively revealed. Subscribe Criminal Verse, where every crime hides a story.